What's up, everybody? This session is called Messy Characters and Breadcrumb Trails. That sounds like me eating, I guess. And developing how do you say that? Revelatory language for players with the amazing Toiya Finley and Toiya Kristen Finley. And here she is.
Hello, everyone. I am the aforementioned Toiya Kristen Finley, and thank you so much for joining me today. I am a game designer, narrative designer, game writer, editor, and diversity consultant. I'm also a writer and editor outside of games. I'm the co-author of the Game Narrative Toolbox and the editor of Narrative Tactics for Mobile and Social Games, Pocket-Sized Storytelling. As of late, I've been editing and writing AAA games, indie titles, and interactive fiction for mobile. And I watch a lot of TV, whether that's network, cable, or streaming, so you can partially blame my viewing habits on this talk. A couple of years ago, I realized there were a couple of stories, one TV show and one manga, where after reading or watching, I just had to go online to see what people were saying about them. To this day, I still go online immediately afterwards. I'm a lurker, so I don't engage, but these are stories that make me think. Sometimes it's as simple as, I wonder what will happen next. Other times I'll start theorizing about a plot point or what a character might do. I want to know if other people who read and watch are picking up on the same clues or story and character beats that I am. Now, I want to point out that I'm not necessarily talking about fandoms or shipper wars or fandom cultures and subcultures. I am talking about people coming together to share their thoughts, positive or negative, help each other understand things they may have missed, or speculate on where the story and characters are headed. I've asked myself, what about these stories make me want to connect to online communities that are discussing them? But the more I thought about it, what I really wanted to know was, what are these stories doing in the way they're told that is getting audiences excited enough to constantly theorize about them? I don't think what these stories are doing is revolutionary, but in this talk, I'm going to address their storytelling techniques in ways that I like to contextualize what I believe they do so well. What are the design keys we can use to make our game so engaging that our players are driven to find out all they can about the world and share it? Hopefully, when I'm finished, I'll have shared ways to add greater depth to storytelling in games and contribute to players' emotional investment. You might think of a story that sends you online or makes you theorize as I'm talking, and see if it has the same characteristics as the stories I'm discussing here. What is the number one key to getting players so invested that their level of engagement and excitement helps them learn the developer's breadcrumb language that keeps them searching for answers? Immersion. Now, immersion discussions have become a bit cliche, and our eyes tend to glaze over at the mention of it, and we really don't think about what it means anymore. But I want to talk about immersion in a way that gives us a new perspective of the concept. Want players to notice all of your clues in the sound, level design, dialogue, environmental narrative, and the text players find? You need immersion for them to get the most out of the world. Want immersion? You need to start with great characters and character development. You might be saying, wait, why are characters a starting point to immersion? With immersion, the player experiences a psychological phenomenon. Immersion as a process is automatic, unconscious reaction to or interaction with the environment. And immersion requires cognitive empathy, the ability to take the perspective of another person. So the entryway to immersion is taking on the perspectives of characters in a game. We'll come back to how that happens in a bit. I'm going to start analyzing a couple of non-games first because I think we can take what stories in other media do well and apply it to games. These stories have a couple of characteristics in common. As I said above, they're not reinventing storytelling, but they're taking what we consider necessary for good or satisfying storytelling and adding a little spice to engage audiences on deeper levels. These stories, Attack on Titan and The Good Place, sent me on my original quest to understand what it is about these stories that get audiences so invested in them. By the way, there will be spoilers in this talk. I'll try not to give too much away, and these will be things that have been revealed some seasons or volumes ago, as the case may be. We know that stories have to have compelling characters that we love, hate, or love to hate. If we study how to create great characters, we're instructed to create characters with both strengths and weaknesses, add a couple of weaknesses here and there. The weaknesses, though, make the character more realistic, and we often don't see these weaknesses on display that constantly remind us that the character has some severe weaknesses or foibles. The weakness usually shows up to spur on a major plot point or character arc to test the character or help them develop. Note, I'm intentionally not going to call these characters three-dimensional. That's another term we use so much that we sometimes don't consider what it actually means anymore. With messy characters, their weaknesses are a big part of who they are. They're fundamental to the person. We're not allowed to forget about these weaknesses because they're often on display. And as I suggest in the name, those weaknesses are messy. Their messiness is more than weaknesses or character flaws. It includes things they struggle with and have difficulty overcoming, things that have happened in their lives or aspects of their lives that they want to change. This is a little different than the hero or protagonist who is constantly overcoming problems. These messy weaknesses are often the cause of a plot point or exacerbated by conflict, but they're often on display during quiet character moments and dialogue meant for characterization or to illustrate how relationships are growing for better or ill. So in other words, messy characters are four-dimensional characters. Or messiness is another way for us to make characters more believable or realistic, because a character's messiness is a way to make a more complete person. Realistically, a weakness doesn't show up to drive a plot point or kick off character development. That weakness is always there. And when that weakness does create a problem, it feels like a natural part of the story. Attack on Titan's fandom wiki describes the story's premise this way. It's set in a world where humanity lives inside cities surrounded by enormous walls that protect them from Titans, gigantic humanoid creatures who devour humans seemingly without reason. The protagonists, when they're not fighting off Titans, spend much of their time trying to figure out what the Titans are and what motivates them. They discover that some of these Titans are not mindless, and there's a very conscious human within the Titan and piloting it. If you watch anime or read manga, you're probably familiar with Shonen Protagonists. Shonen protagonists tend to gain skills and power up faster than other characters who have been working for years on their craft. They're naturally gifted, and it doesn't take them long before they realize they're amazing at their ability they just discovered. Eren struggles. He struggles and fails a lot. It takes him a while to figure out how to maneuver in his Titan form, and other Titan shifters can overpower him. Armin is one of Eren's best friends. He's a strategic genius. He has a genuine hope for the future, where his people will be able to live beyond the walls and see these mythical places his grandfather taught him about. Despite being super intelligent, he has low self-esteem. We don't know anybody like that. Even though he was skilled enough to join an elite group of soldiers, he still sometimes questions his abilities. Reiner betrays a group of people whom he trained with, fought alongside, and came to care about. In fact, he momentarily forgets his real identity due to PTSD. He can't face the reality that his friends learn of his betrayal. Reiner is in this position because he was forced into war as a child soldier. A lot of fans really like and sympathize with him, even though he's a villain. They want Reiner to finally be at peace, and he can never seem to get it, no matter how hard he tries. Now, if you have not seen The Good Place and plan on watching it, I will not give away the most major of spoilers because that would be really evil of me. Eleanor had an awful upbringing. Her parents, who had a terrible marriage, neglected her. She declared her independence from them and raised herself. She didn't care about anyone else, using and manipulating people she might call friends. Her job was to scam senior citizens, which she did not feel a little bit badly about. When she desires to become a better person, she can still be snarky, but she's also blunt in a way that her friends need to hear, and she's someone her friends can rely on. Chidi is absolutely brilliant and has a love of philosophy. He pursues philosophy because he cares about humanity and wants to make life as best as it can be for everyone. He's a loyal friend, but he's incredibly insecure about offending or hurting other people. He's so terrified of hurting his friend's feelings that he can't be honest with them. In fact, when he has decided to be honest, he's done it in a way that wounds his friends. He suffers from crippling anxiety and gets stomach aches. And we don't know anyone like that either, I'm sure. Tahani is from high society England and is well educated and well connected. If you've heard of a particular celebrity, Tahani knows that celebrity. Her parents unfairly made her be competitive with her sister. No matter what she did, her parents ignored her efforts. So every time she brags, it's because she's conditioned to seek attention, approval, and love. This is the main reason why Tahani was so involved in charitable activities. Bless his big, dumb heart. Jason. Jason is usually in a good mood, and he stays in a good mood. He's incredibly childlike, and he is always his friend's greatest cheerleader. Jason's biggest problem is that he likes to commit crimes, lots of them in the most spectacularly stupid ways possible. He is the epitome of Florida man. Back to that taking the character's perspective I mentioned earlier. You probably noticed I said, "We don't know anyone like that," several times. The more believable characters are, the more we relate to them on some level. Social psychology has revealed several ways in which we connect with characters. The first is identification. Jonathan Cohen says that the reader adopts the character's goals, comprehends plot events in reference to these goals, and experiences the feelings that result from the interaction of these goals and the events that take place. The audience member comes to internalize the character's goals within the narrative. Cohen and others' theory is that the audience so empathizes with the character that they internalize the character's identity. Audience and character become one and the same. In a shared experience, they take on the character's goals and the emotions they experience trying to achieve those goals as they run into conflicts the plot and other characters throw at them. In parasocial relationships, we're not identifying with characters, we're not seeing them as ourselves. But we are establishing an imagined conscious or unconscious relationship with them. As Keith Oatley says, character-based stories encourage a sense of shared humanity as a general mode. In a more specific mode, people form relations with fictional characters. Such relations are called parasocial because they are one way. Characters cannot interact with a reader. Nevertheless, these relations can be intimate and important to the reader. Both general and specific modes tend to foster the emotional understanding of others. Or, to put the parasocial relationship another way, it is when we feel a connection to a fictional character, we experience the character kind of like an avatar, vicariously living out the experiences we see, or read, or hear, as they unfold in front of us. Doesn't that sound a lot like what happens with video games? When we find that characters are similar to ourselves or we have an affinity with them, we get a deeper appreciation for their motivations and their reactions, according to Victor Airston. That's because we may have similar motivations or reactions. From our perspective, they're like us. Feeling that kind of affinity can lead to empathizing with the character. But whether we empathize with the character or not, perceived similarities between us and the character make us more immersed in the story, making us more invested in the story and the character. So identification is the audience internalizes the character's identity and goals. In parasocial relationships, the audience lives vicariously through the character. And with similarity, the audience has affinity with the character's behaviors, motivations, and actions. All of these lead to greater engagement with the character and the narrative. The result of identifying with characters or having parasocial relationships with them or having an affinity with them is that we're invested in what happens to them in their story worlds. Based on life experiences, values, goals, fictional preferences, etc., people are going to have different levels of experience and connectedness with characters. I don't tend to identify with characters, although I might feel an affinity with them. Some audience members or players internalize characters' identities, but it's not necessary for these techniques I'm discussing to be successful. What I do think is necessary is that an audience becomes invested in the character's struggles, and they want to help resolve those characters' conflicts. That means that the audience may not like a character at all. but they may know somebody who's just as messy. Or a particular weakness in a character is something that they recognize in themselves, and they may sympathize, if not empathize. And once that happens, because we've got characters who are extremely believable, we become invested because we're rooting for them, or we're annoyed by them and really want them to make better choices, or we're wondering what's going to cause their downfall because we cannot stand them. Not liking characters is also a possibility. I'll be honest, I've watched shows waiting for a character's downfall. Beyond watching or reading or playing, our imaginations are interacting on a more involved level. Our imaginations are engaged with lots of questions. What's going to happen next? How are they going to get out of this? What dumb thing are they going to do to blow the whole thing up? And once our imaginations are involved, we can start looking for clues, details to tell us where the story's headed or what's going to happen to the characters or information about the story universe. I like to call what we're looking for revelatory breadcrumbs. To me, it really feels like that's what I'm searching for. These give us more investment in characters' successes or failures. Once we're connected to characters on some level, a trail of revelatory breadcrumbs deepens our commitment to the story and our interest in the characters. These breadcrumbs keep audiences wanting to progress through the narrative. If we look at different plot diagrams in Western storytelling, like from Aristotle and Freytag, what usually comes 3/4 of the way through the plot is the epiphany. You may have seen something like this, or this, or this. But if we really think about it for a second, all stories are built upon little epiphanies. We learn one thing, and then another thing, and then we find out this thing. It's what keeps the story moving. In the stories we're looking at, revelatory breadcrumbs are a type of smaller epiphany that build to larger epiphanies. Revelatory breadcrumbs are rewards to the audience. The story acknowledges them for paying close attention or figuring something out that's not directly stated. Or, quite frankly, storytellers have hidden a revelatory breadcrumb like treasure, and the audience discovering its meaning is really special. Revelatory breadcrumbs are a means for the audience to keep engaging with the story. What am I going to learn next? What am I going to figure out next? The storytellers say to us, this is important. Can you figure out why before I tell you? Revelatory breadcrumbs understand that everything doesn't have to be explained, and audiences can piece them together to discover their relevance. So what can be breadcrumbs? Well, that's going to be anything that provides a clue or points to information that can lead to bigger revelations or epiphanies at some point. These breadcrumbs can communicate things about the plot, the world, or characters. Here's a non-exhaustive list of types of breadcrumbs. Decision-making, foreshadowing, lore, in-jokes, or Easter eggs. We can make our breadcrumbs major, mind-blowing, twisty revelations that change everything our audience knew about the world or the characters or the story. But they don't have to be shocking twists. They could be very small things that aren't consequential but still enjoyable for the audience, like a character note. So let's start with a minor example. And when I say minor, I'm not passing judgment. Minor revelations can be incredibly entertaining and worthwhile. So here's a revelatory breadcrumb from The Good Place that connects knowledge from the real world to its fictional world. You do need real world knowledge for this one. That's not a fault for these breadcrumbs. It's similar to members of the audience finding something rewarding because they get the in-joke. So here's a TLDR version of my real world connection to this one. The knowledge you need is some understanding of American football and the National Football League, or the NFL. I am a long-suffering Tennessee Titans fan. The Jacksonville Jaguars are in the Titans division, ergo they are the Titans' rivals. Jason Mendoza is from Jacksonville, Florida. He's a huge Jacksonville Jaguars fan. The first joke here is that the Jaguars aren't very good, but Jason thinks they're amazing. While Jason is a Jaguars fan, he's an even bigger fan of Blake Bortles, who was the quarterback of the Jacksonville Jaguars. In fact, his catchphrase has been, Bortles! The second joke is that when The Good Place started airing, the Jaguars were bad. Then they were really good and had a chance to go to the Super Bowl. In the show's universe, the main character's actions led to the Jaguars being good. Now, that's quite a revelatory breadcrumb. But the one major consistent issue for the Jaguars during that time has been Blake Bortles. He could be good, okay, or awful, but most of the time hovered in the meh range. And Jason, being Jason, thinks a decent to mediocre quarterback is amazing. After the 2018 season, the Jaguars cut Bortles and signed Nick Foles, who won a Super Bowl with the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, fans of the show wondered if The Good Place would ever mention that Bortles had been cut and how Jason would respond to the news. Again, Blake Bortles is someone Jason absolutely loves and mentions constantly. Based on the breadcrumb trail The Good Place established, fans knew this was something Jason would care about. The show basically set us up to anticipate how it would address Bortles being cut. Well, at the end of an episode, Jason finds out Bortles has been cut. He's crushed. But when he finds out about Nick Foles, he says, Nick Foles? Are you kidding me? Jason asks, seemingly upset. He won a Super Bowl. We're going to be unstoppable. Then he yells, Foles! Of course, that's not the end of the story. In the first game of the NFL season, Nick Foles broke his clavicle. So fans wondered if The Good Place would cover that. It did, and Jason was crushed. This trail of breadcrumbs does not change the overall story. It doesn't change the story's universe, but it's based on a particular character. It's based on something that's important to Jason, which makes it important to fans of the show. The trail of revelatory breadcrumbs from Attack on Titan is significant to its overarching plot and characters. It changes how the characters and the audience by extension perceive the world and what's happening in it. Again, spoilers, but these have been out for a while. Two of the nemeses in this world are the Colossal Titan and the Armored Titan. Unlike the mindless Titans that go around eating people, these Titans are even more destructive. Early in the story, the Colossal and Armored Titans are responsible for breaking a wall that has shielded people from the Titans. One of the mysteries of this series is, who are the Colossal Titan and Armored Titan? We know that human beings are piloting them. Now, if you're familiar with mecha anime, these are basically flesh mechs. For years, manga readers searched for clues to their identities. They scrutinized the art and the dialogue. And then, in one very long, very detailed post on the Manga Fox discussion boards, someone figured it out. I started reading the manga long after their identities had been revealed, and I remember reading this post, which was spot on about everything. And then there were tons of skeptical comments that it received. So the reader figured out by following all of the subtle and not subtle breadcrumbs Hajime Isayama left. Because I could spend a whole talk or two on just these breadcrumbs themselves, I'll highlight a few of them. And notice how you as game developers can use these techniques. The actual physical appearances of characters are big clues, especially in manga and anime. So the Colossal Titan is tall, the tallest Titan, and Bertholdt is tall. He's the tallest scout. The Colossal Titan gives off a lot of heat. Bertholdt sweats a lot. The Armored Titan is blonde and buff. Reiner is blonde and buff. In Chapter 11, Reiner somehow knows that the Titans don't give off smoke, but they give off vapor. The characters don't know very much about Titans at this point. In Chapter 13, Armin asks Bertholdt and Reiner where they're from. After looking a little nervous and hesitating, Bertholdt tells a vague story about where he and Reiner are from. They escaped when the Titans breached the wall, but he doesn't really remember what happened after that. And in chapter 15, as Eren recounts the time the armored titan attacked, Isayama cuts to a shot of Reiner. These breadcrumbs incorporate lore one character knows and others don't, that titans give off smoke. It incorporates dialogue. Armin asks Bertolt where they're from, and Bertolt answers, and it incorporates visuals. Bertolt looks nervous when asked something specific. The focus is on Reiner when Eren talks about the armored titan. So, what do messy characters and revelatory breadcrumbs look like in games? I'm going to give several examples, and then I'm going to look at how games are uniquely positioned to make these techniques even more demanding of our investment because of their interactivity. I do want to give a contact warning while I'm covering this game. Life is Strange's content deals with pretty serious subjects and features characters struggling with depression, suicide, and abuse, and storylines featuring sexual assault. So I'll give everyone a few seconds. Okay. Max Caulfield is the player character and protagonist of Life is Strange Season 1. Personality-wise, she's a little awkward and introverted. She's been living in Seattle, but at the beginning of the game, she's recently moved back home to Oregon. She received a scholarship at a prestigious high school for art. However, it is very clear that she has imposter syndrome. She constantly compares her work negatively to other students and doesn't seem to feel worthy of attending Blackwell Academy. None of us know anyone with imposter syndrome at all. Before Max moved to Seattle, Chloe was her best friend, and depending on the player's choices, that relationship can move beyond friends or get worse. Chloe is extremely creative and smart. At the age of 13, she's a blossoming storyteller when her father is killed in a car accident. At that point, her life spirals out of control. She loses her father, whom she was close to, and then she loses her best friend Max, who moves to Seattle and eventually stops talking to her altogether. She's a gifted former Blackwell student. At the time Max returns, Chloe's mother is in a relationship with a man who is abusive to Chloe. Chloe is rebellious, she's angry, she acts out, and her behavior is dangerous to herself and to others. Oh, and she gaslights and guilts Max into doing what she wants, often bringing up that Max ghosted her, and displays jealousy when the player, through Max, decides to spend time with other characters. For example, Chloe doesn't want Max to take a phone call from Kate. She doesn't know that Kate's in a crippling depression and really needs a friend, but it does show how possessive she is of Max. Kate is one of Max's peers at Blackwell. She's a musician and artist who wants to illustrate children's books. She's from an extremely religious family, and she can sometimes look down on others because of the judgmental culture she grew up in and because of her beliefs. She's roofied at a party, victimized by one of her teachers, and bullied by other students in that aftermath. This leads to trauma, depression, and suicidal tendencies. Again, with all three of these characters, their faults or things they're struggling with are often at the forefront during their interactions and dialogues. One of Life is Strange's Season 1's mysteries is actually answered within the first half hour of episode 1 out of 5. So, okay, here's some major spoilers if you haven't played the game. The villain actually tells you that he's the villain in a sort of veiled way within the first few minutes of the game. It's classic mystification like Agatha Christie employs in the first few pages of her novels. Once Jefferson is revealed to be the villain, players could go back to that scene and say, oh, how did I not notice that? Now, I thought the line was weird in episode 1. It bothered me, but it is not what convinced me that Jefferson was an evil operator. I noticed Jefferson seemed really creepy, but a lot of players thought he was cool and really liked him. And I thought, am I the only one seeing what the devs are hinting at here? To my surprise, I could only find one person online who was critical of Jefferson. Mari of the YouTube duo Geek Remix did a theoretical analysis on Jefferson, and she confirmed my thoughts on him. And you'll notice that she later added she was right to the title of the video. Some things that were quite disturbing to me were the interactables found in the environment. Within the first 30 minutes of episode 1, the player takes control of Max and can explore Jefferson's classroom, the school hallway, and the grounds in front of the school. Jefferson has photos on the walls of his classroom, and the school has an exhibit of his photos on the school grounds. The photos all have the same grunge aesthetic. The creepiness of these photos is obfuscated. Jefferson became a photographer of renown during the early 90s in Seattle during the grunge era. Now, we know for certain that this is what the devs are communicating to us because in a Life is Strange sequel, there's a book of Jefferson's work with the title Teen Spirit. However, players can interpret the photos in other ways. The subjects in these photos are young women in vulnerable poses. Heroin chic was also a part of the grunge aesthetic. Some of the women in the photos look like they could be high or strung out. Add that to the vulnerable poses they're in, and it's not hard to think that Jefferson is taking advantage of these models, or at least he has a preference for seeing women in this way. From the opening cinematic up until this conversation with Stella, Max is never even slightly critical about Jefferson. Why would she call Jefferson aloof? Why would she say she's not sure about him? All she's done is gush about him because Max thinks he's amazing. So what are these dialogue choices about? This is the first chance the game gives players an opportunity to voice their opinions of Jefferson. The fact that these responses aren't exactly glowing is a clue in and of itself. Why does the game give us the opportunity to think and say these things? If the player chooses to make a comment about a female student who's hostile to Max, Stella says of Jefferson and a missing student, "You have a lot to learn here at Blackwell. Rachel Amber absolutely had sex with him." Well, I heard that from a good source. Now, Stella has a crush on Jefferson. Still, what she has to say about him is not exactly flattering. Keep in mind that none of these breadcrumbs are explained. The player does not have to experience any of them. Like breadcrumbs left on a trail, the player has to find these. They have to explore the classroom. They have to explore the school grounds. They have to find Stella, have a conversation with her, and choose, or at least see, the dialogue in the part of the tree that's critical of Jefferson. Finding this information is not necessary for the critical path or to progress through the game's story. If you're not familiar with Monster Prom, it's a single and multiplayer visual novel dating sim. You have 3 weeks to win over one of several of Spooky High's most popular students and get them to go to prom with you. The game is written with razor-sharp wit. And it has a lot of depth, both gameplay and story-wise. The original game has 394 events, leading to 1,408 outcomes and 23 secret endings. Part of the metagaming is figuring out how to unlock all of them. All of these unlockable events is something that keeps players returning to the game. A great reward for unlocking events is getting more clues and concrete information about the world and the characters. The dateable characters are all friends and they're super popular, which means they look down on those who are not. Each character is a type of monster and represents a particular archetype found in society and school cultures, like a party girl ghost or a dumb jock werewolf. They're monsters, so they've been involved in things like extortion, arson, vandalism, genocide. They do bad things, is what I'm saying. But they do have enduring qualities. For example, Liam is a vampire hipster who loves the obscure and hates the mainstream. However, there was a point in time when he belonged to a K-pop band. And that may have been a revelatory breadcrumb for some of you. Now, mileage may vary on how well games show relationships. I think other media have an advantage over games when it comes to displaying and developing relationships, and that's because of the ways those stories are structured. They tend to have more time to show different facets of several characters' relationships with each other, and that part of the storytelling isn't interrupted by gameplay. Monster Prom makes it a point to highlight all of the relationships, and it's a big part of the game's depth and storytelling. Julian Quijano, the creative director and a writer for Monster Prom, has given several talks on the game's design and writing. He points to the importance of the characters being well-rounded, and an important aspect of that is that they have well-defined relationships with other characters. This is a slide image from one of his talks which he tweeted from Monster Prom's account. It illustrates Polly's relationships with the other love interests by focusing on the defining characteristic of each relationship. As Kikano says on the slide, we're not the same with everyone. Make them real, make them unique, make them spherical. So whenever Polly appears in events with these characters, you can see how her relationships are different with each. This is another important point about messy characters and how to make them more realistic so that players make a connection with them. We're able to see the relationships, both positive and negative, with other characters, and those relationships illustrate the character as a more complete person. Both Life is Strange and Monster Prom are episodic or have a lot of content that you can unlock over a period of time, and TV shows and manga are serialized, and their stories are told over an extended period of time. I want to make it clear that what I've been discussing works for any kind of game or distribution model. Undertale is an RPG that takes about 15 hours. It's not episodic. It was released all at once. What it does brilliantly is subvert the idea of grinding in RPGs. In a typical RPG, you go around killing enemies, increasing your XP, and leveling up. In Undertale, killing enemies is viewed by the monsters in that world as actual murder. You can kill nobody and befriend all of the bosses in the game, kill some bosses and or mini bosses, or kill everyone in the world. Playing both the pacifist and genocide routes shows you different aspects of the main characters, and either befriending these monsters or becoming their enemy is a major part of the game's gameplay and story. As I explained, part of the whole point of the game is to discover who these monster characters are and what happened to them and their world. Undyne is one of the bosses in the game. The player has to make several specific decisions in order to get some revelatory breadcrumb lore from Undyne about another character. So after the player meets all of those prerequisites, Undyne has a monologue about a monster enemy the player encounters and fights. Shiren, who is shy, as her name suggests. She likes to sing but doesn't have confidence in her voice. In the phone call, Undyne details her relationship to Shiren. Undyne used to give Shiren piano lessons. Shiren's not essential to the story, but her place within it and her history and relationship to Undyne are revelations that deepen the world and give players a deeper appreciation of it. There are revelatory breadcrumbs that point to the side story, and players determine some of the breadcrumbs they find. If they befriend Undyne, they will see the piano in her house. The breadcrumbs the game puts in front of the player are during fights with Shiren. Her character design suggests she's shy and not confident. The player encourages her to sing, so considering her personality and that she loses her sister, it makes sense that she became reclusive, as Undyne tells us. Throughout the game and in multiple ways, monster enemies who don't seem important are given in-depth histories. Holistic storytelling is used in medicine and psychology and even digital marketing. But I'm going to use the term a little differently. Holistic is really the best way to put it, and I can't think of a better adjective. Holism is the steady state or equilibrium of a system, the integrated whole of these parts. For our purposes, the system is the game and includes its gameplay and mechanics, its characters, its art, its sound design, its animations, its story, and its world. In other words, the system is the game. The integrated whole of a game is achieved through its narrative design. I like to say that narrative design ensures that the story and world embody the gameplay. We know that gameplay mechanics and choices we give players are all aspects of storytelling. So the game's narrative design enhances that storytelling and helps players draw meaning from the story and help them create their own narratives. The story and world can influence and inspire gameplay so that players stay immersed and tell their own stories. Any part of the game that players interact with is the game space, and any part of the game space can be a part of the game's narrative design. Narrative design uses writing and other aspects of the game as storytelling vehicles. So, narrative design equals story delivery. That means any way you can use aspects of the game to illustrate the story, world, or characters through story and non-story elements is via narrative design. And that includes narrative structures, dialogue systems, cinematics, world building, mechanics, controls, art, animation, UI, anything. In games, narrative design is holistic storytelling. What's unique about games is that players can determine what breadcrumbs they find, what they would like to discover, and how much energy they exert in finding them by choosing to interact with characters and the environment. Life is Strange has some of the most brilliant narrative design I've seen. When Max leaves the classroom at the beginning of the game,
a total loser.
Oops, sorry about that. So she wants to drown out the world around her, and at the same time, she puts her earbuds in, the soundtrack starts. What we're listening to is what Max listened to.
I hate that class. It's so fucking boring.
She's so fucking shy. Selfies with a friend.
The songs in the soundtrack are to Max's taste and the kind of music she enjoys. There are even times in Max's dorm room where you can turn on her stereo and have her play along to the songs on the guitar. We get a voiceover hearing Max's thoughts when we interact with objects in the environment. And the font in the UI and menus is Max's handwriting. The UI design is evocative of Max's sketching style. We know this because Max keeps an in-game journal in the same handwriting. Life is Strange's narrative design is a reflection of Max's personality, what's important to her, and her inner world. It's holistic storytelling based around the player character and protagonist. Narrative design is the means we can develop a breadcrumb language by using it to communicate what the breadcrumbs are, where to find them, and how players can engage with them. In other media, the audience reads, sees, or hears the breadcrumb trails. In games, they're actively engaging with these breadcrumbs. Games have a myriad of ways to design their revelatory breadcrumbs and the language between devs and players. But for them to be successful, they have to be well integrated into the game's narrative design. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of content for players to unlock in Monster Prom. Damien is literally a resident of hell. He likes destroying things, he's loud and brash, he's a dude bro. Damien gains depth, however, when you learn about why he'll always fight for love. He learned from his fathers that love is a strength, not a weakness. Through Monster Prom's narrative design, this breadcrumb gives us some characterization for Damien and world building from the Monster Prom lore because we learn his fathers formed an alliance in hell. Life is Strange's narrative design creates a world of revelatory breadcrumbs discoverable through gameplay, and how those breadcrumbs are experienced through Max's personality. So let's break down the conversation with Stella again and how this is the player's opportunity to respond to what they've experienced at the beginning of the game. The narrative design facilitates a language communicating how to find these breadcrumbs through the narrative structure, environmental narrative, and the dialogue system. It's important to carefully plot where players will engage with or find these breadcrumbs. At the time Max can have this conversation with Stella, why is he aloof here? Why does the player have the opportunity to have Max say this? Through her inner dialogue at the beginning of the game, Max has done nothing but gush about Jefferson. She hasn't said anything negative about him. This choice of dialogue is a revelatory breadcrumb, and it's based on other revelatory breadcrumbs. This dialogue is from the player's point of view, not Max's. This is the game acknowledging that the player may have a different perspective about Jefferson than Max does. So this dialogue choice has several functions. It rewards the player for exploring. The player does not have to talk to Stella. It rewards the player for noticing clues about Jefferson or being suspicious of him, and it provides more clues through Stella's reaction to the dialogue. And in Undertale, the narrative design uses mechanics and branching paths, kill monsters or not, give undying water or not, environmental narrative, The player can make the piano connection, seeing a piano in Undyne's house, and the menu. This is where the player makes calls to Undyne. Okay, so how are we going to design our messy characters and revelatory breadcrumbs? So for messy characters, focus on their background and how they got to be the person they are at the beginning of the game. Things that can shape them include their relationship with their parents, not having any parents, their relationships with their siblings, their relationships with friends, their educational background, their religious or spiritual beliefs, their life-altering moments, among many other things. Now, give them some major weaknesses and personality flaws. These should be things that cause the characters to struggle internally, and when they're faced with conflicts, these weaknesses exacerbate problems. Their weaknesses should sometimes cause problems. Figure out their relationships to other characters by showing off different aspects of who they are through these relationships. Be sure to illustrate how both their messiness and their strengths influence the relationships. You do need to consider what the scope of your game can handle. Make sure that you limit yourself through scope. What kind of breadcrumbs can you have? How many? How many can you design in time for your project's launch? Asking and working with your team, if you have one, is really important here to define the scope. It is really, really easy to go beyond scope, especially when your ideas are flowing. So here are some other questions you can ask yourself about scope, and these are by no means exhaustive. Are your breadcrumbs only plot and character based? Are these going to be extra content and not part of the critical path or main gameplay and storyline? Are they delivered through art, sound, animation, etc.? Plan out when in the narrative you're going to reveal them or where along the plot you'll drop your breadcrumbs. Plan out how the player will find or engage with them, and then consider how you will signal to the player that the breadcrumb is, in fact, a breadcrumb. There are all sorts of ways to drop these breadcrumbs, and players learn what they should pay closer attention to, establishing a language between players and the game. So there's art. Shiren's character design illustrates her shyness and reclusiveness. Undertale establishes a language with the player that character design says a lot about characterization. Environmental narrative. We can see that Undyne plays the piano because there's one in her house, so it's not a surprise when we find out she gave Shiren piano lessons. We get a clue into Mr. Jefferson's true character when we see his photography around the school. Both of these games show players over and over that they can learn by paying close attention to what's in the environment. Interactables. There can be objects or items in the environment that players can touch, whether that happens in 3D, 2D, or text. We can get the player character's thoughts about those items, or we can read lore that contains the types of clues we'd like to give the player. Dialogue. What NPCs, player characters, or players choose to say can be revealing, like Max's conversation with Stella. Several lines of dialogue suggest to players that maybe Mr. Jefferson shouldn't be lionized. Players learn to pay attention to the dialogue throughout. Mechanics. What players can do can reveal important information. Choosing to spare Undyne instead of defeating her leads to players possibly befriending her. Befriending her leads to revelatory breadcrumbs in Undertale's world. Easter eggs. These are hidden messages we leave for the player. They can appear anywhere or at any time. These are usually visual, but they can be anything that might be difficult to find. They usually serve as a wink and a nod, and they're rewarding for players because they're hard to find. Once players find an Easter egg, they tend to look for more of them. Random events. Players won't get these through skill, but because they're special and there's a lower percentage chance that players will experience them, these are perfect for dropping little nuggets players wouldn't otherwise know. Unlocking random events becomes desirable, and players will try to find out how to get them, as is the case with Monster Prom. Unlockables like events, party members, among other things. These can be all sorts of ways that players can unlock content. Part of the fun for them is to figure out how to do it, whether they use online aids or figure it out on their own. Revelatory breadcrumbs are great rewards for unlocking something. Monster Prom has many unlockable events, so some of them lead to secret endings. These events give players more insight into the characters and the world. Once you have your breadcrumbs, how do you hide them or get players to hunt for them, to know that there's something they might not think are important at first? Detective fiction has mastered hiding clues, and I think we can learn a lot from that genre. Before I close, I want to give a list of ways to, in the words of Catherine Emmett and Mark Alexander, do a little attention manipulation. Make details seem significant when you first introduce them. Then make them seem like they aren't important through a false trail. Then reveal they are important after all. So Jefferson announcing he's the main villain at the beginning of Life is Strange is an example of this. Introduce items, information, etc., without drawing attention to their significance. Jefferson's photography on the school grounds and Undine's piano are examples of that. Show the significance of details once you downplayed when you give players reveals. So Jefferson's aforementioned line of dialogue, seriously though, I could frame any one of you in a dark corner and capture you in a moment of desperation, becomes very, very clear once you reveal that Jefferson is the villain. Here are what I believe are the important takeaways if we're designing messy characters and revelatory breadcrumbs in order to make our game narratives more engrossing for players. For messy characters, make their flaws a significant part of who they are. Make it clear what they're struggling with internally and externally. Define their relationships with other characters and let players see those relationships in action. And with revelatory breadcrumbs, reward players for their curiosity. Signal to players that you're leaving a trail for them. Incorporate breadcrumbs into your overall narrative design. Determine how many breadcrumbs your scope will allow. And design breadcrumbs through collaboration with your team. Thank you so much for joining me today for this talk. Here is where you can find me. And I do have to admit that on social media, you're mostly going to get posts about animals, especially dogs.
And especially dogs. What kind of dogs do you like? All of them?
All of them.
We love dogs. We have 2 like pit bulls, right? But I really want a corgi so I can carry it around on my motorcycle, right? And then I would name him something like really mean, like Cujo or something like that. So if you guys have
name for corgi,
yeah, they have a corgi the Cujo. If you guys have some questions, I'm scrolling through this chat here. This is a long chat. If you have some questions, please feel free to pop them into to the chat here, and we can pop them up on screen. Here we go. Question. Random Rosemary. How can you avoid cliche tropes, breadcrumbs, and storylines?
Okay, that is a great question. I think educating yourself on cliches is super helpful. There are a lot of them. And so it's just getting a knowledge base of what cliched tropes are. And you probably already know what some of them are. Like if you are watching something, playing something, reading something, and you come upon something that makes you roll your eyes, that's probably because it's a cliche. If you can see it coming, it's probably a cliche. So one thing that you can do, like if you are finding cliches in your work, subvert them. For example, I gave the example of Eren as a subverted shonen hero. He's really bad at stuff. He struggles a lot. So he is a shonen hero of the story, so he has to work at getting good at things. It's not given to him naturally. So that's my biggest recommendation is just read up on lots of cliches. And then if you are looking at your own work, you can fix cliches by subverting them or intentionally subvert tropes so that you throw curveballs at players.
So what do you think about, like, for example, horror movies Everything they do is cliche. Like the girl hears a noise and after a whole bunch of murders or something, and then she's like, she walks outside by herself. What's out here? So what do you think about using cliches in a way that supports what you're doing?
I think you gave a really good example with it being horror films, because that's a genre expectation, right? When we are watching or playing certain genres, we expect certain things to happen. So you are going to be listening for that loud noise that's going to bring the jump scare. If it, if somebody walks into a really dark room, you're going to expect something to jump out from behind them. So I think it's a good point. Like, what is the genre that you are working in? What is the player expecting from that genre? And you do want to give them what they are expecting, but you do want to give them a little bit of difference each time, because you don't want them playing the exact same thing that they've played before. So like, put your own twist to it. Kind
of like when horror movies started doing the thing where you're expecting a jump scare and then it doesn't happen and you're like, ah,
right. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Jennifer Wenner. Question for Toiya: is there a distinction between revelatory breadcrumb and emergent narrative beyond creator intent? What happens when the player confuses an emergent narrative for a breadcrumb and fails to find the expected conclusion?
So here's the point of our conversation where I admit that I have never worked in emergent narrative. So I will be guessing at this. But through playtesting, what I would do is look and see what our players thinking is an actual breadcrumb. And then, it doesn't come to its expected solution. Use your flaws to your benefit. Can you make it a breadcrumb? Are enough players running into that it would make a natural breadcrumb? Maybe that's something that your players are telling you, that it's something that you did not expect, but the players are. So use that to your advantage. It's like with narrative designers, sometimes we can make the flaws part of the story for real. So, the programmer doesn't have to go back and debug something. It just becomes a part of it. So what are your players telling you?
All right, so here's the melancholy man. Are breadcrumbs necessary for games that are primarily linear?
Well, they can be. You don't have to have breadcrumbs in a story if you don't want to. But the thing with breadcrumbs is they're rewards. So even in a linear story, you can reward your player for paying attention. You can have a linear story where something happens between characters, and maybe that character is upset and you choose to do something that further upsets that character. Well, if you had been paying close attention to that particular conversation, you wouldn't have done the thing that upsets them. So that's a type of breadcrumb for the player who's paying close attention. So even in something that's linear, where players aren't going off and exploring lots of things and finding things like books in the environment, you can still have things for players to find that are within the story itself, and they're like little nods, the wink and a nod, like, hey, you were paying attention, thanks for playing.
Okay, let's see, here we go, another one from Jennifer. When making the player character and the story within the narrative design, how do you balance the character's story and voice while still allowing the player to connect with the character that might not share any life experiences or personality aspects of the player? These are good questions.
Well, so there are different types of player characters. So you have a cipher where that character really doesn't have a personality, and the player is going to basically project their own self onto that cipher. And then you have somewhat customizable characters. So the player might customize something about them, and then you give them a certain personality or backstory. And then there are player characters, where you determine who that character is. The player does not. And so I think your question is pointing more to the latter, where you have a player character. That player character has very determined personalities, a very determined background and history. And so I wouldn't worry so much about players not having the background and life experiences of that character, I would work on making that character believable. Think about games where you've played a character where you don't have anything in common with them, but you still really love that character. It's because that character was authentic, that character was believable. There were probably things that you loved and didn't like about that character, but they were like a real person. And so the more that you make a character believable, the more that players are going to like that character or feel some affinity with them if they don't, identify them with them totally. So don't worry about your players' experiences and whether they're the same to the character or not. Just write a great character.
Just write a great character. We are out of time for this. And there's a bunch of questions that I know everyone has. If you want to go into the Discord at discord.gg/indiegamebusiness, and if you would like to spend a little extra time in there, Toiya, which would be awesome, there's a section on the left, the East Coast Game Conference, the Career Lounge, right? There's Career Session Chat, and if you wanted to get into a voice chat over there, that would be awesome as well. It's all up to you. But if you guys wanted to go into the Discord and check that out right now, that would be awesome. Do you have some time, Toiya?
Yeah, I'll be in there for a few minutes. I'll
be in there for a few minutes. Yeah. There's only like 47 more questions for you. So yeah, maybe you could jump into the voice chat or something. And then if you wanted to, it's just an option. But we've got somebody coming up next, and they are going to be ready. Oh, you know what it is? It's the Game Hers. It's the Game Hers, I believe, is going to be there.
Thanks, everybody.
I could be wrong, but I think I might be right. Wait, I could be wrong. You know what? It's a surprise. Thank you all.
Thanks.